You'd think the guy on the bathroom floor at 7 p.m. on a Tuesday, soaked to the elbow, negotiating with a 3-year-old about whether the water is too wet, is just tired, worn down, running on fumes like every other parent his age. He isn't. He's exactly where he wants to be, and some part of him that he couldn't fully explain if you asked him is quietly, chemically, grateful to be there. 35 years old, kitchen still a mess from dinner, phone buzzing somewhere in the other room with a work email that can wait, and he is fully, completely present for a debate about wetness that has no correct answer and doesn't need one. His own father never sat on a bathroom floor. Not once. Not because he didn't love his kid. He did, in the specific, load-bearing way men of his generation loved things, which is to say by handling them. The roof. The car. The tuition. If you'd asked him whether he loved his son, he'd have looked at you like you'd asked whether Tuesday came after Monday. Obviously. Why would you need it said out loud? Here's the part nobody expected. For most of the history of parenting research, that question, why some fathers go quiet and others don't, barely got asked at all. Half of every parent on Earth is a father, and the science looked almost exclusively at mothers. Fatherhood itself sat there, unstudied, treated like a footnote to somebody else's chapter. Then somebody finally opened the footnote, and what they found didn't look anything like some men just aren't wired for closeness. For decades, the working theory was simple, even if nobody said it out loud. Men don't go through anything like what mothers go through. Pregnancy changes a woman's body and brain. Fatherhood, presumably, changes a man's schedule and not much else. Nobody bothered to check that assumption for a very long time. When researchers finally did, comparing fathers to non-fathers, they found something nobody predicted. Fathers carried measurably higher oxytocin and lower testosterone than men without kids. Brain regions tied to reading facial emotion and to reward lit up more strongly in fathers, specifically when they looked at their own child's face. Not a vague dad brain. A specific, measurable rewiring, running in a body that grew up being told this stuff mostly happened to women. Matt's father never got tested for any of this. Neither did Matt, for that matter. But somewhere in that bathroom, with a towel over his shoulder, his biology is running exactly the experiment the researchers described, whether he knows it or not. Here's the detail that sounds too strange to be a real study, and it's not from a parenting blog. It's from a lab. Researchers gave a group of fathers a dose of oxytocin, delivered through a nasal spray, then sent them in to play with their toddlers. Later, they ran the same fathers through the exact same play session after a placebo instead. After the real dose, the fathers played more actively, more responsively, more engaged than they did after the placebo. Same men, same kids, same room, different chemistry, different father. Sit with that for a second, because it quietly wrecks a very old assumption. The distant dad, the one who loves his family from a chair across the room, was never a fixed setting on male biology. He was a switch that had simply never been flipped, because nothing in his life had gotten close enough to flip it. Matt doesn't know this study exists. He just knows that an hour on that bathroom floor leaves him calmer than he was before it started. He assumed that was just a feeling. Turns out it might be measurable in a lab with a needle and a spray bottle. Here's where it gets stranger, because the body doesn't wait for the birth certificate to start changing. A study tracking men through their partner's pregnancy found that fathers with lower testosterone and lower vasopressin during that period went on to be significantly more involved once the baby actually arrived. The shift wasn't triggered by the sleepless nights, or the diapers, or the on-the-job training everyone assumes fatherhood runs on. It was already underway, quietly, in the background, months before any of that started. Gary, Matt's father, never got the benefit of anyone telling him this. He went back to work 3 days after Matt was born, because that's what the job, and the neighborhood, and every man he'd ever met expected. Nobody suggested his body might have been trying to point him somewhere else the entire time. Nobody was listening for it. Here's the finding that should end the "some men just aren't built for this" conversation for good, and it barely gets mentioned anywhere. Involved fathers show a real hormonal shift. Aggression-linked testosterone goes down, prolactin goes up, the same hormone that shows up in breastfeeding mothers. But that shift depends almost entirely on physical proximity. A father who sleeps near the baby, who gets up and answers the crying himself, shows the shift strongly. A father who doesn't have that closeness barely shows it at all. This isn't a story about character. It's a story about distance. Gary's whole generation built a version of fatherhood with less physical closeness engineered into it by default. Provide during the week, show up on weekends, love expressed through logistics instead of proximity. Reduce the closeness, and you reduce the biology that closeness would have triggered on its own. It was never that Gary's body couldn't do what Matt's does most nights. It's that Gary's body was never given the closeness required to try. Here's a number that doesn't fit neatly into the millennial dads are just better narrative, and that's exactly why it matters. Research on families carrying significant unresolved trauma found that 46% of them show measurably altered parenting patterns. Not occasionally struggle, measurably altered. The silence, the flinch away from vulnerability, the retreat into logistics instead of feelings. It isn't randomly distributed across families. It runs in traceable lines. It goes further than habit, too. Research out of Harvard and Mount Sinai found that children of parents who experience severe stress can carry altered cortisol and amygdala responses of their own, which means emotional distance might not be purely something a son picks up by watching his father across the dinner table. It may leave an actual physiological trace, passed down before anyone involved gets a say in it. This is the part that should sit uncomfortably. Matt isn't simply outwilling Gary through better intentions and a parenting podcast. He may be working against something wired into him before he understood there was anything to work against. That makes the bathroom floor a harder thing to choose than it looks from the outside. Here's a number with actual weight behind it, not the vague millennials are just more evolved version of this story you've already heard. Time-use data comparing Gen X and millennial fathers found millennial dads spending more hours on childcare than Gen X fathers did at the same stage of life. The detail almost nobody mentions. That increase came directly alongside a decrease in hours spent on paid work. Not extra time pulled from nowhere. Time taken straight out of the job. Gary's generation, structurally, mostly didn't make that trade. Work came first, without much of a conversation about it. Matt's generation is quietly renegotiating that deal, one bath time at a time, at a real cost. Slower promotions, smaller raises, a version of providing his own father wouldn't fully recognize. This isn't proof of moral superiority. It's proof of a specific, measurable choice an entire generation started making, mostly without realizing they were part of anything larger than their own Tuesday night. One more layer, because the biology isn't uniformly on anyone's side, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. Researchers found a specific combination: high testosterone paired with high estradiol, that predicted lower parental sensitivity in fathers, not less love. Less attunement in that specific hormonal state, regardless of intention. Which means some of the men still stuck in Gary's pattern aren't failing morally. Some of them may be fighting a hormonal hand they never got the environmental nudge to overcome. The proximity, the oxytocin, the closeness that tips things the other direction. Understanding that doesn't excuse the silence. It explains it. And explaining something is usually the first real step toward changing it on purpose, instead of just inheriting it by accident, the way Gary did from his own father and his father before him. So what is Matt really doing? Negotiating bathwater temperature like it's a treaty? He's sitting inside a feedback loop his own father barely had access to. Every bath, every 2 a.m. response to crying, every hour traded away from the job is quietly nudging his oxytocin up and his aggression-linked testosterone down. The exact shift that Gary's more distant model of fatherhood structurally never allowed to happen. Matt never read a single one of these studies before deciding to be a different kind of father than Gary was. Almost nobody does. He just knew, somewhere underneath conscious thought, that he didn't want his own daughter describing him the way he sometimes describes his dad. Reliable, present at every game, and almost completely unknowable. What he couldn't have known is that the closeness itself was working on him, physically, in a way distance never could have. He thought he was choosing to be a different kind of father. It turns out his body had been quietly rewarding that choice the entire time, one bath at a time. Gary isn't the villain here. He's a man who inherited a pattern nobody named for him, running on chemistry that never got the proximity required to shift, doing the version of fatherhood available to him with the tools he was actually handed. Matt isn't a hero, either. He's a man on a wet bathroom floor, quietly rewriting something that had been running on autopilot for at least 3 generations before he showed up, without a manual, without anyone warning him that the biology would eventually agree with what he was already trying to do on instinct. The world spent decades assuming emotional distance in fathers was just how men were built. The truth, once anyone actually checked, was almost the opposite. The closeness was always available. Nobody had built a life close enough to let it in. His daughter will probably never hear about any of this research. She'll just know her dad got on the floor, that he stayed, that too wet got taken seriously every single time without being rushed. That's not nothing. That might be the whole point.